My wife got pregnant with another man's child and thinks I don't know. My wife and I have been together for nearly 5 years now. We met under what I thought were fairly normal circumstances, workplace romance and all. She was the operations manager of a popular restaurant chain here in Toronto, and I was a sous chef in one of the bustling kitchens she oversaw. Our connection felt instant. I was immediately drawn to her confidence, her sense of humor, and the way she carried herself in a room full of people. And when we started dating, things were amazing. We were that couple people seemed to envy, full of energy, always having fun, and very much in love, or at least, that's what I thought at the time. After a couple of years together, things got serious fast. We moved in together, traveled around Ontario on the weekends, and were living what felt like the ideal life. Eventually, we decided to take things a step further and started talking about having kids. Neither of us wanted to rush it, but when my wife, let's call her Sophie, found out she was pregnant with our first son, I was over the moon. But looking back, I can see that some cracks started forming around that time. As the pregnancy went on, Sophie was working longer hours at the restaurant. She was promoted to a senior management position, and suddenly her work consumed even more of her time. I didn't think too much of it. We had agreed early on that I would stay home to take care of our son after he was born because her salary as a general manager was significantly higher than mine. It seemed logical at the time, and I was happy to be home with our little boy. The first year of parenthood was challenging but rewarding. I enjoyed being a stay-at-home dad while Sophie focused on her career, working late shifts and frequently traveling between different locations across Toronto. Things were still good, and we found time to connect as a couple, although those moments were becoming increasingly rare. But then I started noticing things that just didn't sit right with me. Sophie began attending these mandatory work events that I had never heard her mention before. She'd tell me she needed to go to corporate parties or team-building exercises that were apparently required to keep her job. At first, I didn't question it. I knew she was under a lot of pressure at work, and her position demanded a lot of responsibility. I trusted her completely. But the frequency of these events started to increase, and she seemed almost eager to get out of the house on certain nights. It wasn't just the parties. There were late shifts, last-minute emergencies at work, and team meetings that popped up without notice. She would explain that a couple of people had called off sick, and she had to fill in. Again, I trusted her, and at the time, it seemed like a plausible explanation. But there was a growing discomfort inside me that I couldn't ignore. Then one night, things took a strange turn. Sophie came home from one of these work parties, and she was unusually flirty, more so than she had been in a while. She was insistent that we be intimate that night, almost as if she had a plan. Now, I've never been the type to refuse a passionate night with my wife, so I didn't think twice about it. But looking back, I now realize that it was all part of her strategy to make sure that any doubts I might have about her fidelity would be wiped away. It was as if she needed me to believe that I was still her only one. About a month later, Sophie told me she was pregnant again. And naturally, I was excited. Who wouldn't be? We had always talked about having a second child, and although it wasn't entirely planned, it felt like a natural progression for our family. Everything seemed fine, for a while. But then, as the months passed, something began to gnaw at me. Our second son, let's call him Marco, was born, and the initial joy of welcoming a new baby into our lives overshadowed any lingering doubts I had about Sophie's behavior. But as Marco began to grow, I started noticing something that shook me to my core. He didn't look like me. In fact, he didn't look like Sophie either. Now, both Sophie and I are pretty fair-skinned. I have blonde hair and brown eyes, and Sophie has the same light complexion, with similar coloring to mine. But Marco? As he grew older, his skin was much darker, and his hair was thick and jet black. I'm not talking about a slight variation in appearance here. This was something that couldn't be easily explained away. His features were distinctly Middle Eastern. He looked like he belonged in a totally different family. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe it was just one of those weird genetic quirks, I told myself. Families can have recessive genes that show up unexpectedly, right? But as Marco continued to grow, it became harder and harder to deny the truth. His looks were too specific, too far off from anything in either of our family trees. The resemblance between me and my first son was undeniable, but Marco looked like a stranger in our home. That's when it hit me. I remember staring at Marco one evening as I was feeding him dinner, and the realization came crashing down like a tidal wave. This child wasn't mine. The more I thought about it, the more all the puzzle pieces from the last few years began to fit together. Sophie's sudden late nights, the mysterious work parties, her overeagerness to have sex that one night. It all made sense. I couldn't believe what I had missed. For years, I had convinced myself that nothing was wrong, that Sophie was just busy with work. But now, it was clear that she had been hiding something much bigger, another man's child. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could she think I wouldn't notice? Did she really believe I wouldn't put two and two together? I felt humiliated, but I wasn't about to jump to conclusions without some solid proof. If I was going to confront her, I needed to be sure. That's when I started to think about getting a DNA test. It seemed like the logical next step, but I wanted to approach it carefully. I didn't want Sophie to know what I was doing, at least not yet. So, I started gathering evidence. I downloaded a recording app and began saving audio snippets of our conversations, moments when she was being vague about her whereabouts or changing her story about the so-called work parties. I didn't want to make any false accusations without having something concrete to back it up. For weeks, I collected evidence and did my best to maintain a facade of normalcy at home. All the while, the truth was burning inside me. Every single moment I spent with Sophie, every family dinner, every bedtime story I read to our kids, it all felt like a lie. My mind was constantly racing, trying to piece together the timeline of events, wondering when and how this had all started. I had so many questions, but I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Sophie sat down next to me on the couch, completely unaware that my trust in her had been shattered. She was scrolling through her phone, casually chatting about her day. I played along, asking how things were going at work, nodding and pretending like everything was fine. But inside, I was screaming. She looked at me with those familiar eyes, the same eyes that had captivated me years ago when we first met. But now, all I could see was betrayal. How long had she been lying to me? How long had she thought she could get away with this? The next day, I decided it was time to get the DNA test done. I couldn't take it anymore. Every time I looked at Marco, I was filled with conflicting emotions, love for the child I had raised and suspicion about the truth of his paternity. So I ordered a home DNA test kit. It was surprisingly easy to do. I swabbed my own cheek, then waited for a chance to swab Marco's without Sophie noticing. I felt a strange mix of guilt and determination, knowing that what I was doing could change our lives forever. While I waited for the results, the days dragged on painfully slow. Every little thing Sophie did set me on edge. I was hyper-aware of everything she said and did, analyzing every word, every action. I kept replaying moments from the past in my head, the work trips, the late-night meetings, her flirty behavior that night she insisted on sex. It was all a blur of suspicion and paranoia, and I felt like I was losing my mind. One weekend, Sophie mentioned that she had to go to a mandatory corporate retreat in Niagara Falls. She said it was going to be a 3-day event with her entire team, and they'd be staying overnight at a hotel. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But inside, I was seething. Another work trip, another excuse. I couldn't believe she still thought I was that naive. I decided to do something I had never done before. I followed her. When Sophie left the house that Friday morning, I waited for her to get a head start before getting in the car and driving after her. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I needed to see for myself. I needed to know if this trip was just another cover for her affair. As I drove along the highway, my heart pounded in my chest. I kept a safe distance behind her car, praying she wouldn't notice me. The tension was unbearable. What if I was wrong? What if this really was just a work retreat? But deep down, I knew the truth. I had known it for a long time. After nearly 2 hours of driving, Sophie pulled off the highway and into the parking lot of a large hotel. I parked a few rows behind her, watching as she got out of the car, pulled her suitcase from the trunk, and headed inside. For a moment, I considered confronting her right there in the parking lot, but I held back. I needed to be sure. I needed to know exactly what was going on. I waited for about 20 minutes, my eyes glued to the hotel entrance, when I saw him. A man, tall, dark-haired, and dressed in casual clothes, walked out of the hotel and headed toward Sophie's car. My heart dropped. I watched as he opened the passenger door, grabbed a few bags, and walked back inside. It was all happening right in front of me, and there was no way to deny it now. She was meeting him here. This was no work retreat. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I wanted to storm into that hotel and demand answers, but I knew I had to play it smart. I needed to gather more evidence. So I drove away, heading back home, trying to figure out my next move. For the rest of the weekend, Sophie was supposedly at her corporate retreat, but in reality, she was with him. I didn't hear from her much, just a few texts saying she was busy with meetings. I played along, responding casually, trying to mask the rage bubbling inside me. When Sophie returned home Sunday evening, she acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how the kids were, and unpacked her suitcase like she had just come back from a regular work trip. But I couldn't unsee what I had witnessed. Every word she said felt like a lie. I knew now, without a doubt, that she was having an affair. And worst of all, I was certain that Marco wasn't my son. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the DNA test results arrived. I remember the moment vividly. I was sitting in my home office, staring at the email in my inbox. My hands trembled as I opened it, my heart racing. The results confirmed what I had feared all along: Marco wasn't my biological son. The room seemed to spin around me as I sat there, staring at the screen. The reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. Sophie had cheated on me, gotten pregnant with another man's child, and had spent the last several years lying to my face. How could she do this? How could she betray me like this? I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to throw the DNA results in her face and demand answers. But another part of me was still trying to process everything. I had loved Sophie. I had built a life with her. We had 2 children together, one of whom I had just discovered wasn't mine. How do you even begin to deal with something like that? In the end, I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I had to confront her. So one evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat Sophie down at the kitchen table. My heart was pounding as I tried to steady my voice. "We need to talk," I said, my eyes locked on hers. She looked at me, confused. "About what?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "About Marco," I said, my voice shaking. "I did a DNA test." The color drained from her face. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, she opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She knew she had been caught. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," I said, my voice cold. "I already know the truth." For what felt like an eternity, we sat there in silence. I could see the guilt and shame written all over her face. She had been lying to me for years, and now it was all coming out. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger rise up inside me. "Didn't mean for this to happen? You've been lying to me for years, Sophie. You had an affair, got pregnant with another man's child, and pretended like everything was fine. How could you do that to me? How could you do that to him?" I gestured towards the direction of Marco's bedroom. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I thought I could make it work. "Make it work," I snapped, my voice rising. "By lying to me? By pretending Marco was mine when you knew he wasn't? You thought that was going to fix everything." Sophie was a mess of tears, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for her. I was too hurt, too angry. My life had been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't know how we're supposed to move forward from this." She wiped her tears, looking at me with desperation in her eyes. "Please, we can fix this. I still love you, we can make it work for the kids." But I shook my head. "You don't get it, Sophie. It's not just about the kids. It's about trust, and you've destroyed that. I can't stay with someone who lied to me like this." In that moment, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't just about Marco, or the affair, or even the years of lies. It was about my own self-worth. I couldn't stay in a marriage where I was constantly questioning everything. I couldn't raise a child under the pretense that I was his father when I knew the truth. "I want a divorce," I said, my voice steady. Sophie's sobs grew louder, but I didn't waver. I had made my decision. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew it was the right choice. In the days that followed, I began the process of untangling my life from hers. It was painful, but there was a strange sense of relief that came with it. I was no longer living in the dark, no longer a victim of her deceit. As for Marco, he's still my son in the ways that matter. He may not be mine biologically, but I've been there for him since the day he was born. I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate that relationship, but I know one thing for sure: I'm not going to abandon him, even if his mother betrayed me in the worst way possible. In the end, Sophie got what she deserved, and I got the clarity I needed to move on with my life. The truth may have been painful, but it was also liberating. And now, I'm ready to start over, this time, with no more secrets.